The conversation was supposed to be private, which in a station built entirely out of shared air and borrowed gravity was an optimistic assumption at best. I was leaning against a wall that adjusted its temperature every time I sighed, speaking softly to no one in particular, which is how most human mistakes begin. I wondered aloud what would happen if a human and an alien ever raised a child together, in a place where even houseplants required permits. Would the kid glow in the dark, I asked, or just develop an allergy to bureaucracy? The translation field hummed, politely recording every word for reasons it had insisted were purely medical. There was a pause long enough for me to regret existing. Then a voice answered from my left, calm and unhurried, as if she'd been waiting centuries for someone to ask something that stupid. She said the child would probably learn to listen before speaking, unlike most adults present. I turned and found her already watching me, close enough that the field adjusted without asking permission. She looked human enough to trigger my social instincts and alien enough to make them all wrong. Her eyes didn't blink on the same schedule as mine, and when she smiled, it felt less like humor and more like certainty wearing a friendly mask. She told me she hadn't meant to overhear, which was generous, since everyone on the station overheard everything eventually. I apologized out of habit. She accepted it out of curiosity. We stood there while a service drone argued with a wall about whose fault a spill was, and she asked why humans joked when discussing futures they feared. I said it was either that or scream, and screaming required paperwork here. She considered this, then nodded, as if adding it to a very long list. She spoke of policies without naming them, of councils that debated potential lives as if they were weather patterns. I tried to keep things light, suggested that if hybrids were banned, the galaxy might miss out on truly spectacular sarcasm. She surprised me by laughing, a brief sound like something remembered rather than learned. She said her people feared unpredictability more than extinction, because extinction at least followed rules. When she finally left, the air felt heavier, as if the station itself had noticed something shift. A warning chimed in my head about unauthorized philosophical exchanges. I dismissed it. Somewhere behind me, the translation field logged a single anomalous event and quietly decided not to report it yet. They bound us together before they explained why, which I later learned was considered considerate. The restraint wasn't metal or polymer, but a softly glowing band of force that linked my wrist to hers, warm, as if embarrassed about the situation. An overseer informed us that paired labor increased efficiency by 12% and complaints by 40%, then congratulated itself on the balance. I asked if the statistic included sarcasm. It did not, but it made a note to observe it. She stood beside me with the patience of someone who had already lived through worse ideas. Up close, the differences were clearer, in ways I couldn't easily joke about. When she focused, the air around her seemed to hesitate. When she sighed, the translation field adjusted its tone, as if unsure which emotion to prioritize. She glanced at our linked wrists and said this arrangement was temporary. I said all arrangements were temporary if you were stubborn enough. She replied that stubbornness was a renewable resource in humans, and she sounded faintly impressed. They sent us to reclaim salvage from a derelict habitat that had given up on optimism years ago. The gravity flickered between opinions, and every step felt like a negotiation. I tripped twice. She did not. When I suggested she was cheating by understanding local physics better, she said her people called it listening. I told her humans preferred arguing with reality until it apologized. We worked in silence for a while, punctuated by the occasional alarm and my running commentary on how this was not how I'd envisioned cultural exchange. At one point, the restraint tightened, responding to a spike in my heart rate. She placed her free hand near mine without touching it, and the band loosened, as if relieved. She said the system assumed panic meant inefficiency. I said panic was just enthusiasm without direction. A neural pulse brushed my thoughts. Not invasive, more like someone knocking from the inside. Through the shared field, her voice arrived quieter than sound. She said survival protocols assumed bonds could be imposed. I replied that humans had tried that too, with uniforms and inspirational posters. It hadn't worked out. When the shift ended, they didn't separate us right away. No one noticed. Or perhaps they did, and decided to wait. As we walked back, still linked, she remarked that this was how alliances often began, by accident. I told her that if the galaxy fell because of an administrative oversight and a bad joke, at least it would be memorable. She smiled. Not certainty, this time, but something closer to hope testing the ground. The committee chamber rotated slowly, not for spectacle, but to ensure no single species ever felt properly oriented. I sat in a chair that kept adjusting to my posture like an anxious pet, while she stood beside me, unrestrained this time, which somehow felt more dangerous. The agenda glowed between us, full of polite language describing catastrophic outcomes, hybrid viability projections, cultural destabilization curves, a footnote apologizing in advance for any offense taken by reality. One counselor asked me to speak as a human perspective contributor, which I suspected meant lightning rod. I told them I didn't have a perspective, just a bad habit of asking follow-up questions. For example, I wondered aloud why a civilization that folded stars for fuel was terrified of a child who might ask where they came from. The translation field hesitated, then rendered that into something much less sarcastic. I was offended on my own behalf. She spoke next, not loudly, not with authority, but with the confidence of someone who had already watched these arguments fail before. Through the shared neural space, her words carried memory, along with meaning. She said policies were excellent at preventing surprises and terrible at preventing mistakes. Someone objected that unpredictability threatened stability. She replied that stability, without continuity, was just stillness with better branding. I tried not to grin. I failed. They projected simulations, timelines branching like nervous systems. In some, a hybrid child became a diplomat. In others, a symbol in a problem that justified entire new departments. I raised my hand and asked which outcome involved the least paperwork. No one laughed, but a few probability lines flickered uncertainly. During a recess, a junior analyst approached me privately to ask if humans were always like this. I said yes, but we usually apologized afterward. She listened from across the chamber, amusement threading through the field. She sent me a quiet thought, warm and steady, saying that humor was inefficient but effective. I replied that we specialized in inefficient solutions that somehow worked anyway. When the session reconvened, the tone had shifted. Not agreement, but hesitation. The most dangerous emotion in any bureaucracy. She concluded by saying that life treated as an abstract would eventually behave abstractly in return. That children were not outcomes, but continuations. The chamber slowed its rotation, as if listening. As we left, no decision finalized, she asked if I was afraid. I said yes, but only of a future where everyone agreed too quickly. She said that was a very human fear. Outside, the station lights dimmed for artificial night. Somewhere, a system updated its models and quietly removed certainty as a variable. The decision arrived the way most important things did in that place, quietly embedded in a system update that pretended it had always been there. I learned about it because my access badge stopped buzzing at me for existing. The committee hadn't approved anything heroic. They had done something far more radical. They had delayed, indefinitely. Policy frameworks were under review, which in bureaucratic dialect meant fear had met doubt, and neither had won. She found me on a balcony where the stars were projected slightly out of alignment to discourage romantic thinking. I was recalibrating a drink that insisted it was nutritious. She said the long memory archivists were uneasy. I said that was their natural state. She corrected me, uneasy for the right reasons this time. We talked about what came next, which turned out to be mostly waiting and small acts of defiance disguised as normal life. She would remain as a liaison, which meant staying visible. I would stay too, which meant being noticed. I joked that humans were terrible at invisibility unless someone asked us to leave. She said her people were the opposite. Together, she thought, it might balance out. The translation field hummed less now, as if it trusted us. Sometimes she spoke aloud, sometimes through the shared neural space, and sometimes not at all. I learned to tell the difference. I learned to pause before filling silence with jokes, though I still did it when things mattered most. She never stopped me. She said humor was how humans checked whether the future was listening. One sol later, a revised protocol circulated. Hybrid life was no longer categorized as a risk. It was listed as a responsibility. No one admitted who'd changed the wording. I suspected everyone. I asked her if this meant the galaxy was ready. She said readiness was a myth invented by species that hated surprises. Then she asked me if I still feared the question I'd asked on that first day. I thought about it and realized I didn't. Not because I had answers, but because I no longer believed the question belonged to systems. As we watched the stars drift back into alignment, I understood what had changed. I had arrived here trying to survive without causing ripples. Now I was content to make waves as long as someone else could swim. She stood beside me, human-shaped and unmistakably not, certain without being rigid. Somewhere, probability engines recalculated futures with fewer absolutes. I raised my glass to that and said, half joking, that if a child ever did glow in the dark, we'd figure it out together. She smiled and said that sounded like a promise, not a plan.